Hi guys, in this tutorial we're going to build an Asteroids game, and this tutorial is suitable for beginner level students. However, I do expect you to have basic Java and JavaFX knowledge and basic IDE knowledge as well, depending on what IDE you use. So you can create a new project called Asteroids. We're going to create a new package and create a new file in there called Asteroids app. First thing we'll do is extend the JavaFX application. We'll then need a starting point, which is the entry point, called public static void main, and then we can call stage show. We also need to set the scene for our stage, and then create the content for that scene. We'll need to have a root node, which is, I usually use pane, which is sufficient enough. Let's call it 600 by 600. We will then need a concept of a game object. So let's create a class for that. In professional game development, you typically differentiate between a game object model and game object view. But since this is a beginner level tutorial, I'm going to make a hybrid game object with view together in combination with a model. So we'll take view as a parameter. In Asteroids game, you're able to rotate the player. So let's have methods for querying rotation. So as you can see, we don't actually define field for rotation. We use whatever the angle of the view is. We can rotate right, which is essentially set rotate view get rotate plus say 5. In a similar way, we can do rotate left, which is -5 degrees. We'll also need an idea of velocity. I'm going to use point2d because it also represents a vector 2d in JavaFX. By default, it's going to be 0, 0. Probably need some form of update where we can change the x and y positions of our object, which is the view's positions. We need to know whether our object is alive or not, because if it isn't, then we'll remove it from the game world. So we can query whether it's alive, and we can also set it to being alive or dead. That should be enough for now. Right, let's also have set velocity and get velocity. And also get view because we want to display it at some point. I think it's good enough. We'll need a timer, which will drive our updates. So this is essentially what you will see in the literature being called the game loop, or the main loop of the game. In the game, we're going to have the player type, the enemy type, and a bullet type, I suppose. So we can move around and we can shoot. That's complex enough for this basic game. So we're going to have a list of game objects called bullets. Enemies, and we'll also have a player, which is also a type game object. We can now actually extend our game object so that we can assign views. Inheritance is usually not very popular in professional game development because you would want to be able to combine features of different types of entities. So if you are interested in that kind of thing, look up Entity Component System, which is a very powerful mechanism to use composition over inheritance. But for now, inheritance is good enough. I suppose it need not be public. The view is going to be a rectangle, 40 by 20, and let's pick a color blue. I tend to use blue for the player, red for enemies, and brown for bullets. Let's make enemies circular, say 15. So that's the radius, that's center X, center Y, and color red. And finally, we can have our bullets. Actually, let's keep them circular as well. That will make it easier to rotate. In fact, we won't be rotating, and this is why it's going to make it easier. If you want to be able to rotate things like rectangles, so not circular objects, then you can look up one of the videos on this channel to deal with vectors and points. Let's make the bullets smaller. So we can now create our player. Set velocity to right. So this is going to be a vector pointing towards the positive y-axis. On update, what we want is to check if bullets are colliding with enemies. So we'll need another method here to check if something is colliding with something. We can use JavaFX method bounds in parent, which checks the bounds of the view. Again, there might be problems if your view isn't the same size as your model. But currently, there is one-to-one mapping from the model to the view, so it shouldn't be a problem. For each bullet, go through each enemy and check if we collide. if yes, then set alive to false for both of those objects. In fact, we shouldn't be continuing the loop, because if it happens that a bullet hits two enemies in the same frame, then both enemies will be destroyed. So keep that in mind. We can then, well, we should then remove all the dead bullets. So for each bullets remove if is not right. We don't have is not alive. So let's have another method called isDead, which is simply return not alive. In which case we can then nicely use the method reference. And that translates to go through all the bullets. If a bullet is dead, remove it from the list. In a similar way, we can do enemies. Now that we've cleaned both those lists, we should probably update each object. And also update the player. At some point we want to add a bullet, an enemy to those lists and to the root node as well. So the root node is where our graphics are stored, graphics objects. So this is essentially our spawn function. We're going to translate x and y of the view and also add the view to the root node. And we're going to have two different methods for spawning a bullet and an object. And we're going to call this method. So this one adds the bullet to the list of bullets, and the other method spawns it in the scene graph so that we can actually see the object on the screen. Right, the bullets are spawned because of the user input, so the user controls how the player shoots, but the enemies are going to be spawned at random. Let's give it this value. That should be enough. Because this method runs 60 times per second. So if we make this value bigger, then there will be too many objects spawning. And we'll also spawn them at a random location. I suppose you could replace those using get preferred with first height. So this is the only place where you change width and the height of the game. Let's see this run. So we have enemies spawning. We now need to spawn the enemy, the player as well. Let's spawn them in the center. We also want to be able to control the player. Actually, since the player is already moving, the only thing we need to do is simply change the rotation. So let's do this. Right, and well, and also the shooting, which is going to be spacebar. So if it's left, then player rotate left, rotate right, and shoot is essentially create new bullet. Bullet set velocity is the velocity of the player, which we haven't changed yet. Because rotate left simply rotates the view, but it doesn't actually change the velocity. We can obtain a vector from an angle using cosine and sine of the angle. So the x component is the cosine, the y component is the sine. It's angle in radians, which means we have to convert it to radians as well. And also do the same when we rotate right. So now rotate left and rotate right will also update the velocity, which means we can then use something like this. Although we probably want the bullet to travel faster than the player. So get velocity, normalize it, and multiply by the speed we want the bullet to travel at, say 5. And we also want to add the bullet to the game world. And the positions are going to be position of the player. So by controlling the player, we can change the rotation of the player, which also updates the velocity. So we can rotate right, rotate left. When we press spacebar, it shoots a bullet, but we haven't updated the view yet. And this is why it's not removing from the view. So this line will remove it from the view. These lines will remove it from the model. So we can now shoot, and it removes the enemies when the bullet is colliding with them. You also might want to think about what happens to the bullet if it goes outside of screen, for example, like this. It still travels, but you probably want to clean it up at some point because we don't want too many bullets just hanging around. Right, so this is the basic game of Asteroids. There are various improvements that you can add. In fact, this is probably the most simplistic version of Asteroids. You can add collision between player and the enemy. Also, you probably want to keep the player on the screen as well. You may want to have a varying velocity, so when the player is not moving, so if he's idle, velocity is changed to 0, which means the player view also is not going to move. Apart from that, this is it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.